Good morning, everyone. I'm Rabbi Shankman. Welcome to our Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series on this beautiful but cold morning. I'm really looking forward to this morning's presentation, which we bring to you in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. I'm thrilled and honored this morning to invite and to welcome our speaker, Dr. Leah Garrett, who is professor and director of Jewish studies at Hunter College, City University of New York. She has published 5 books in Jewish studies and won and was shortlisted for numerous literary prizes. Her last book, Young Lions, How Jewish Authors Reinvented the American War Novel, won the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award for Modern Jewish History and was shortlisted for the National Jewish Book Award. Her latest book, which is the one about which we'll be speaking this morning, is Troop, the secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. And she has it right behind her. And it was featured on CNN, Time Magazine, The Guardian, C-SPAN, and a range of other venues, including the Washington Post. If you didn't see that, and I'll put that link up in the chat as well. It just appeared, I think, Friday, maybe Thursday. The Daily Telegraph called it a thrilling story well told, while the Times of London labeled it as gripping, and the Jerusalem Report called it stunning, an incredible moving story of Jewish heroism. Troop is being translated into Hebrew, Polish, and Russian. Dr. Garrett has lived all over the world, but now resides in New York City, where she lives with her husband, the thriller writer Adrian McKinty, their 2 daughters, and 2 cats. And we are so thrilled to have you with us this morning and to have the opportunity to talk about your book. And you know, I had not read that review before I actually read the book, and it is so spot on and true. It is a thrilling story. It is gripping, and it's amazing when we consider that it is all true. So tell us about Troop. Why were they created? Who were they?
Thank you. And thanks for having me. And I'm actually glad we're doing it by Zoom. I prefer in person, but I would never been able to get there. So I'm really lucky that it's happened. And the Washington Post article came out on Yom HaShoah Day, and I didn't know it was coming out. So it's been pretty thrilling the last few days to get the story of these men out, particularly because most Americans don't know about them. And there'd been a lot of press coverage of the book in the UK. So I'm really happy it's hitting here too, because it tells a different type of story about World War II and the Holocaust, because the story we hear over and over again is about kindly Gentiles saving Jews. And this is a story about Jews saving Jews and saving themselves and fighting back. So very briefly, because I know we'll talk in more detail, but the Troop was a secret commando unit created by Winston Churchill in 1942 when the war was going really, really poorly for the Brits. And they knew that they needed to do something radical. And what they decided to do was create a range of different commando units with people who had languages. So there'd be a Polish troop for people who had been in Poland and wanted to go back and fight. There would be a French troop, but most importantly, there would be something that they called 3 Troop or Troop, which would be a German-speaking unit. And the idea with these guys was that because they had the German, they would go out in battle, and because they were trained as commandos, they would kill and capture the Nazis or the Germans, but then the ones they captured, they would interrogate them on the battlefield itself and get that intelligence at that moment, rather than having to wait to take the people back to base. So in America, we had something called the Ritchie Boys, which is also German Jews who had German language, but they were just counterintelligence. They were on base interviewing the captured Germans. These guys are incredible because they're capturing the Germans first as commandos. And I know we're going to go into more detail, but basically the idea wasn't that they would all be Jewish, but when they were looking for German speakers who wanted to go back and fight the Germans, they were all Jewish. And almost all of them, as I'm sure we'll talk about, came as kids or teenagers on kinder transport. All of them were Holocaust survivors. All of them were dealing with family members who were still in Germany or Austria, a couple of in Hungary. And so when they were given the opportunity to fight in this commando unit, they became the most crucial actors, in my opinion, in World War II. They were at the tip of the spear in all the major battles. And just two more quick points about them before we go into more details. But one point about them that's really interesting about writing the book and telling the story of these incredible men and Washington Post talked about in their article, which was that when they were chosen as commandos, the British military knew that if they were captured, they would be killed as Germans, they would be killed as Jews, they would be killed as stateless citizens. So what they had all of them do was pretend that they were British. So officially, X Troop was actually called the British Troop, which couldn't have been further from the truth. And so when they were all selected, they were given about 30 seconds to come up with a new British Anglo-sounding name. They were given Church of England dog tags. So if they were killed in war, they would be buried under a cross. And they all had to come up with backstories that told why they had these German accents. The second really crucial part about them, before we go into more details, was that they ended up being, it was so clear so quickly that these guys would be the best of the best and would be so crucial to World War II, that the Allies winning the war, that the British also made this unusual decision about them. Unlike any other commando units usually fought together. These guys were parceled out in 2s and 3s and 4s to existing commando units, because the Brits knew that two things. One, if like a roadside bomb went off, they were too crucial and they didn't want to have everyone wiped out. But second of all, they knew that with their language skills, their passion to fight, their high intelligence, their incredible training, that they would be crucial to all the other commando units in the war. So they were put in other commando units to fight at the tip of the spear for all of them. And that's why when I tell the story of X Troop in my book, they're at all the major battles, because they're being sent to, they're in Sicily, they're at D-Day, they're at the Battle of the Bulge, they're everywhere at the front of all these other different commando units. And just one last thing about being buried under a cross. The book, it's so incredible to get to write a book about a true story that's unknown to the world. And one of the really surprising things about writing this book, like I've written a lot of other books, was to sort of watch history in action and to see that when we record history, it really matters. And so when the book came out last May, about 4 months after the book came out, I was contacted by a woman in California who said that her great uncle had been in the troop and that he had been buried under a cross. And was there anything that could be done about this? So I put her in touch with this archivist and this Jewish veteran in the UK named Martin Sugarman. And I said, look, there's this family in the United States, they're Jewish, the great uncle's been buried under a cross, is there anything you can do? I didn't hear anything from them. And then about a month ago, I was invited to watch a Zoom link, and I watched the Zoom link, and it was, I cried from beginning to end as I watched a full Jewish military ceremony as they reinterred from a cross to this beautiful Magen David, and they did a whole memorial, and there's a plaque about who this guy really was, that he was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. And so, you know, it has been the most moving research project of my life, because it's been so personal and it's been so immediate, the changes that are happening getting the story out.
That is amazing. How did you first discover this story? I know you've written other books, but how did you discover this story, and why did you want to tell it?
So I had written my last book about World War II, about Jewish American veterans, because my family is all Jewish American veterans. I'm married to somebody whose family is all in the military. My brother-in-law was in Iraq and Afghanistan. I know it's not popular, but I'm a huge supporter of our troops, and I'm a huge supporter of Jewish veterans in particular. And so I wanted to write another story about Jewish veterans, and I had thought all the stories had been told, but I'd heard these rumors about this secret commando unit, and I started to research it a couple of years ago. I read it very, very quickly, because when I started to write it, I actually discovered that there were still 2 commandos who were still alive. So I knew the clock was ticking. I needed to interview them while I still could. And I was lucky I got to interview living commandos as well. But it was like the minute I discovered the story, and then had this shocking realization. No one had written the book about these guys. I just worked day and night I went to archives all over the world. I visited and became friends with the children of a huge number of the commandos, who were so generous sharing their stories, because basically what would happen is I would contact the kid of a commando, and it would be sort of like they were waiting for somebody to come to the door and say, can you show me your dad's photos or diaries or letters? So there was a massive wealth of information that nobody had put together. And I got very lucky that I got to be the one to write this book.
Well, we also got to be very lucky that you wrote this book so that we could hear the story that really had not been told and is incredible. So how, approximately how many commandos were there total, and how did these future commandos end up in the UK? And there were some, at least in the stories that are told in the book, in Troop, there are a number of different paths. So how did they end up in the UK? How many were there originally? If you have I don't know if you know the total number.
So the number varies. Officially, there was 87 of them, but it looks like there may have been up to 120 as they refilled the numbers of them. All of them came as youth, as teenagers. Either their parents would have to make the most horrific and impossible decision, which was, as we all know in this audience, that when with the rise of Nazism, you know, I was going to say bullshit, but bullshit ideas why didn't the Jews go get out? We know there was nowhere to go, right? Like nobody was taking these people. So the majority of them, their parents had to make that impossible decision to put their teenage sons on trains with kinder transport or by themselves often. Because fortunately, the UK had two good things. One is they had the kinder transport program, which we all know about. The other thing they had was a really strong transit visa program. So a number of them came on transit visas with the idea that they would go somewhere else, and then they just ended up staying, or they came on kinder transport. Most of them came by themselves as young men, 15, 16, 17 years of age, some of them a little bit older. And so that's why it was also remarkable to write this book, because when I think about World War II and the Holocaust, you know, I read all the World War II books to write it. I know the story of World War II, but there were very few historians. There's a couple. There's a guy named Andrew Roberts who's really good, but very few historians who would tell the story of World War II and the Holocaust together. And I believe you can't separate them. You can't tell the story of World War II without the chapter including what's going on with the Holocaust. And so part of writing this book and part of why the story of these Jewish guys was so important was it was this continual reminder that World War II is the Holocaust and the Holocaust is World War II. So all of the guys who become ex-troop commandos I call them all Holocaust survivors, because all of them are being forced to leave family members back in Germany and Austria and Hungary as well.
So tell us a little bit about what they experienced, what their lives were like before they became commandos. You know, they were from different countries. They had different experiences with the rise of Nazism. What were some of those experiences and what were their lives like?
Well, one of the guys I focus on heavily in the book is Manfred Gans. And this is Washington Post wrote the article mostly about Manfred Gans, but he's really paradigmatic in a number of ways. I shouldn't say this, but they all come from these incredibly loving, wonderful families. Most of them come from secular Jewish families in Vienna or Berlin. Manfred Gans is unusual because he actually comes from an Orthodox Jewish family. So that was unusual, but his story was typical because they have these good childhoods, they're happy, their parents are doing well. Most of them are middle class, some of them are working class. With the rise of Nazism, things change overnight for all of them. What Manfred said about his childhood in Bork in Germany was like, with the rise of Nazism, he found just the most simple things. He wasn't allowed to play soccer anymore. He wasn't allowed to go to the pool. For his family, because they were both Orthodox and Zionist, they responded to it by sort of learning Hebrew, pushing Zionism, being more entrenched in their religion. For most of them, that wasn't what they did. They were bullied, they were beaten up, their parents were disappearing. One of the guys that talked about his dad's taken to Dachau right before the war breaks out and he's killed at Dachau. That was more typical. Once they come to the UK, for all of them, they feel a sense of palpable relief that they're finally free. They all talk about, now I'm free, but they're in a state of terrible agony because their families are still back there. And at first in the UK, things seem to be going well. You know, they live on like orphanage farms, or some of them go to university with different things. But one of the things I write about in the book, which is really one of the most shocking things I discovered, well, relearned about writing this, was that when the war breaks out, Churchill infamously says this thing, which is color the lot of them. And the way in the United States we set up internment camps for Japanese Americans, in the UK, they set up a series of internment camps for Germans and Italians. And what they decided was the most dangerous status was to be a single male. Now, all of the guys who are ex-troopers are single young men, right? And what the British government doesn't account for is that something like 85% of the German refugees are Jewish. They're all Jews. So the story of all of them before they become commandos is actually a terrible story of internment. They're interned in the Isle of Man behind barbed wire. They respond by creating cultural organizations, all these ways that Jews always respond. But for a number of them that I write about, they're actually shipped to Australia and to Canada in the most horrific anti-Semitic conditions possible. And a group of them go on something called the Daenerys ship. And I actually, one of the commandos who was still alive when I wrote the book was a survivor as well of the Daenerys passage, where the crew was completely anti-Semitic. He told me about them smashing glass on the ship deck and making all the Jews run barefoot over it. So it was, and then they're interred in the outback of Australia for a year. And what they all said about the internment was the hardest thing was not being locked up. The hardest thing was that they were not given newspapers. So they had no idea what was going on with the war and their families. They had no letters. Finally, after a year after Pearl Harbor, the British government realizes this is insane. They let everyone come back. And for these Jewish German enemy alien refugees, they are given the opportunity at that point of joining the military, but it's only the non-combat military. It's the guys who build roads and, you know, build bridges and stuff like that. They're not given guns. They're still not trusted. And then finally in 1942, they create this unit. And what many of them said about it was just head spinning. One of them guys I write about in the book, I can't remember the exact quote, but he goes into the interview to be a commando. All of them, when they're in this thing called the Pioneer Corps, they're constantly telling their commanding officers, I want to be in the military. Like they sneak off the base. They take the test for the RAF, which is really hard to get into, all this stuff, but they can never get into the proper military because they're German Jewish aliens. And one of the guys says it was head spinning when he went into the interview to be an ex-trooper, because he went in, as he said, being trusted not to hold anything more serious than like a broom. And he walks out of the interview being told, like, you're going to be a member of the most elite commando unit in the British forces. So that's their backstories. And the really other crucial part about all of their backstories is, and I think it's the reason why they were so effective in the war and so important in the war, was because for all of them, the war was personal. This was a personal story of needing to get rid of the Nazis so they could find any family members who were still alive and rescue them. That's what it came down for every single one of them. It also came down for all of them, which was also why they were so effective, that they knew, they always said, I knew when I went into battle, like when I landed at Normandy or whatever it was, the guy I might be firing at might have been that bastard in my high school who beat me up as a Jew. So it was a double personal thing. It was to rescue their family, and it was also to write a world in which this terrible thing had happened to their people.
So you described it as head spinning for them, and especially for those who the description of what happened on the Daenerys, you know, the glass, but also things like tossing their belongings overboard and awful really anti-Semitism that they were experiencing at the hands of the British officers. But you talked about it as head spinning, and when you think about the timeline of how long they were interred, and then then they started this training once they were accepted to be commandos in X Troop. The turnaround time for them to become going from these refugees, most of them not necessarily, they might not have thought of themselves as the soldier type. They wanted to, they had the inclination, they certainly had the drive, but they didn't have the training. What was that training like? Because it's amazing to think about from where they started, and then the stories of what they did is absolutely incredible.
That's such a great question. The training was one of the funnest chapters I could write, because so when they're selected for commandos, they're told to stand on line. They don't know what's coming, right? They go into this building, and their commanding officer, who's this guy called Brian Hilton Jones, absolute hero of my book. I mean, he was a Welsh officer. He wasn't Jewish. And he looked at these guys as his sons, and he treated them like their sons. He went to the ends of the earth for these men. He loved them. And for all of these guys, he totally became a father figure to all of them. But anyway, so they walk in this office. They don't know him yet. And he says, tell me what your new Anglo name is. And they're given like 10 seconds. I'm going to be Fred Gray. Okay. What's your backstory? Why do you have a German accent? I had a German nanny. Here's your Church of England dog tags. So they go in there as these German Jewish refugees, middle class, not warrior types. They come out, now they're British, right? They have these new stories. Now, then what happens? I mean, they can barely remember their own new names, and then trying to remember everyone else's new names, because most of them knew each other from internment or the Pioneer Corps. So they're put on a train, and this is like one of the most ridiculous things ever, but they're sent to this small Welsh village called Aberdovey, because Brian Hilton Jones was Welsh, and a lot of the commandos were trained in Wales. Because they're commandos, they don't put them in like a camp. They're given cash and said, go find a local family to live with. So they go knock on doors. They're pretending to have these British accents. It's just crazy. And then the training itself takes about a year, because the idea was to make them the most elite commando unit in the UK forces. And so for up to, some of them are pulled out for different things, but between 6 months and a year, they're living with Welsh villagers. They're eating Welsh food. They're pretending to be British. It's just crazy. One of the people who's billeted with them is Miriam Rothschild, who's married to one of them, one of the Rothschilds. She secretly marries one of them. And she did an oral interview, and she said, these guys were nothing like normal soldiers. Normal soldiers would be, out drinking. These guys would walk along discussing Schopenhauer. That's who they were. They came from that world. One of the guys, Peter Masters, talked about how intensive the training was. They had to run up mountains with full packs. They had to practice all of the different type of weapons. They had to pretend to send off bombs. They had to do beach landings with live guns being fired at him. And he said, I couldn't believe that someone like me who wanted to be an artist could now put a blindfold on and take apart like a Colt 45 in 30 seconds. Like they couldn't believe it either. But the idea was to make them incredibly physically superior, but most importantly, unlike, again, like Richie boys who are just trained in counterintelligence, these guys are doubly trained. No other commandos are doubly trained in the British forces. They're trained as commandos, which means weapons, jumping out of airplanes, rappelling up mountains, sneaking into buildings to get intelligence, practicing how to capture the enemy. And then they're also trained in counterintelligence. How do you interrogate the enemy? What do you ask them? How do you get the information? How do you get the intelligence? So they did up to a year of this incredibly intense stuff, all at the same time that they're pretending to be British. Like for Manfred Gans, he was Orthodox. He suddenly wasn't allowed to do Shabbat and stuff like that. And when I wrote the first draft of the book, I sent it to his kids to make sure sort of I hit the right tone with their dad, Manfred. And when I wrote the original draft of the book, I had this transformation into a warrior as difficult for him. Like there's a moment he writes about in letters where he had to send his tallis and tefillin away. Like all of the stuff had to go away. He's now Fred Gray. He's not Orthodox. He eats non-kosher food, all that stuff. And I made it like this difficult interior journey. When his kids read it, they said it wasn't like that. They said he would have done whatever it took. If what it took was you forget all that stuff, you discard it publicly, you do it privately, whatever it takes, because for him, the clock's ticking because his parents have been taken away. So it sounds really hard, but for most of them, and it was really hard, but their eye was on the prize, was they were going to win the war for really, like literally they thought this, I'm going to win the war for the British so that I can save my sister who's hiding in Paris or whatever it is.
It's they had such drive and determination, and they had this really, really intensive training experience that certainly was very much focused on the training, but also, as you talked about, they're in this Welsh village, which is almost this, there's a whole story there about that experience. Were you able by any chance to go to visit the village, and are there people who remember that experience and what it was like having the Commandos there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was planning to go, and then lockdown happens, right? So I wasn't able to go, but it was great because my first talk I gave for X Troop was on Zoom in Wales. Can I sort of jump ahead in time and talk about that village though?
Yeah, please.
Because it's really complicated with that village. So the guys who stayed in that village, for the most part, in their letters and archives, said that there wasn't anti-Semitism, that they were welcomed into the families, but there was definitely a sense that the villagers knew that they were different. They knew, as one of them. Fortunately, what happens after the war is the BBC hears about this troop in like the 70s, and they did a whole bunch of interviews with Welsh locals, and somehow I was given these tapes. It was incredible. And they said things like, the troop would say, we would say, where are you from? They'd say, we are English. Like they knew there was something, these guys all had these accents. It's a question of whether or not there was anti-Semitism. Miriam Rothschild said there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Most of the guys didn't want to go into it, but I'm jumping way ahead in time, but after the war, the ex-troopers decided that they're going to put a memorial to the troop in this Welsh village, and it went up in, I think, 1990. And I have a picture. I have incredible pictures in the books. A reason to get the book, the main reason is the pictures, but I have an incredible photo of the memorial that they put up in this Welsh village. It's a beautiful black granite memorial. Doesn't say the word Jewish on it. Aberdovi puts up a plaque on the seawall, doesn't say the word Jewish. This was a Jewish troop who fought as Jews. The local town council gives tourists a brochure that talks about X Troop, doesn't say the word Jewish in it. That guy, Martin Sugarman, who I mentioned earlier, who got the cross changed to the Magen David. Yeah, oh, thank you. Yeah, it's beautiful. None of it says the word Jewish. So Martin Sugarman has been bothering the Aberdovi Town Council constantly. He sends me emails all the time. He sends to them. They're not adding the word Jewish to this memorial. So what he did was he hired a local Jewish Welsh artist, and he had him make this beautiful brass Magen David that they've now put at the base of the memorial. And I tell everyone, if you go there, bring some Magen Davids and put them at the base. And it's a fight that we're fighting still, because as you know, it's so interesting. We deal with the idea in the United States of how important memorials are. Well, this memorial is writing these guys right out of history. So it's the Jewish refugee organization is fighting them as well. But it's a very complicated history with that Welsh town, and it's still complicated.
Thank you. So let's go back a little bit, but now moving forward. So they go through this training, and then they go off to do missions. Tell us a little bit. Lots of the stories that we have, certainly about Normandy and D-Day, are about really focused on what happened on the beaches. But tell us about X Troop and Normandy and other campaigns, because they have a unique experience that we don't often hear about.
Yeah, so X Troop is crucial to Normandy. I tell the whole story. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but the story I start with is the guy that Miriam Rothschild's married to, George Lane. And he ends up getting the intelligence by landing on the beaches of Normandy in the weeks before the war to find what kind of mines they've laid. And his citation after the war says, because of George Lane, we could do D-Day as planned. So these guys are there even before the landings. Typical, though, of the landing itself, I'm going to stay on Manfred Gans. So again, remember, these guys are trained as commandos and in counterintelligence. So all of them are put with existing commando units to land at D-Day, right? Because they don't let them fight as their own troop because they're too valuable. Manfred Gans and a couple other guys are sent with this commando unit and they're all landing at Sword Beach, which was one of the British beaches. When his boat lands, he's been so trained and he's been told over and over again, leave the beach. That's really important because we know Americans at Omaha Beach get caught there, which is why the slaughter is so big. He's remembering, leave the beach, leave the beach. He lands, I think it's with 45 commando. Immediately, half of 45 commando is wiped out. Manfred remembers his training. He looks up the beach and he sees right by the barbed wire a group of like 25 Germans. And he runs up to them with the survivors of 45 Commando. And in his flawless German said, boys, you need to tell me how to get off the beach right now, with his Tommy gun. So he captures them. The guys are so shocked that they're like, wait, there's this British guy and he's speaking this flawless idiomatic German. Wait, what? They lead him and his men off the beach, and he ends up saving the rest of 45 Commando, again, because of that dual training, right? And then they go inland. And this happens over and over again at the landings, that these guys are right at the front, putting their hands up. Peter Masters said of the ex-troop, where other soldiers in the British military were drawing straws to see who got to stay behind in the most dangerous missions, we wanted to do them. We were drawing straws to see who got to go ahead. So during the day, they're leading their commando units in the movement forward, capturing all of these crucial positions. At night, they're being sent behind enemy lines to lie and stand near the German areas to gather intelligence. So they're working 24/7. And so it's them who ends up capturing these radar, all of these crucial positions. And as the troops move forward through Normandy, these guys are at the front. I'll tell you a story about Ian Harris, who is like one of my favorite guys I write about in the book. Ian Harris grew up in Germany. His parents decide when he's a teenager, he's very physical. They're going to send him to a boarding school. Unfortunately, as he said, the boarding school ends up being the hotbed of the rising Nazi movement. So that's where they go to train the Nazis. And he's there. They figure out he's Jewish and they start to beat the crap out of him. He runs away. But while he's there, he learns stuff about, how do you command Germans, Nazis? Like, he learns all this incredible information. So when the war is going on, he's always putting up his hand. He's always at the front. He's wounded multiple times, and he will walk out of hospitals to get back to go fight the battle some more. One of the many stories I tell about in the book with Ian Harris is that finally, when they cross Germany and they're getting into Germany, he decides he's going to go by himself because the guys he's with, the commando units he's with, he doesn't consider them active enough. He's very happy to be back in Germany fighting. And so by himself, he gets a Jeep and he decides to drive directly into the German battalion in Osnabrück. And he finds the commanding officer, and speaking to him in flawless German, he says, I'm here to take your surrender. This guy by himself, right? And the German commander's like, why should I surrender to you? And Ian Harris says, because we have better weapons than you do. And the guy says, no, you don't. They have a shooting fight. He's using his Luger. Harris is using his Tommy gun. Harris wins the fight. And he ends up getting the full surrender of this entire battalion, which is captured on the News Corps. I have a photo of it in the book. And you see Ian Harris, right? Who's not really Ian Harris. His name he has a German Jewish name, leading like 2,000 Germans that he single-handedly captured back to base. And what Manfred Gans said about them was they were very happy to kill the Germans, but even better was to capture them without, without having to kill them, because then they could interrogate them as well. And that happens over and over again at Battle of the Bulge, all these different places, that's where they are. Again, because for all of them, the clock's ticking. Every day they're at war is a day their family's unsafe over there.
There's an incredible amount of chutzpah. There's confidence in their training, but chutzpah is certainly part of it as well. And they had something and someone really important they were fighting for. So how did they, talking about their family members, the Commandos deal with family who had been taken by the Nazis? The stories run the gamut in terms of what was going on with their families left behind.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll tell you very quickly 3 really different stories. One of the men I talk about is Colin Anson, and I start the book with him. He's living in Germany with his dad. He's a teenager. He doesn't even know he's Jewish until the rise of Nazism. And then his dad sits him down and tells him they're very secular. And he loves his dad more than, I have photos of his dad and anything. And his dad is taken away before the war starts because his dad's politically active against the Nazis. He's taken to Dachau and he's dead within like a week, right? So for Colin, and then Colin Anson gets put on a kinder transport. His mom puts him on a kinder transport. So for him, the whole war was about sort of like what they did to his father. And it's really interesting because after the war, and I'm sure we'll talk about after the war, but after the war, these guys are all they're not done when the war ends. They're all put in charge of the denazification efforts to get intelligence for the Nuremberg trials, all this different stuff, which I reckon we'll talk about. But for Colin Anson, he's put in charge of denazifying his own town. And when that starts, he decides he wants to find out who turned on his father, who turned his dad into Dachau and got him killed. And he figures out who it is. And he says in an interview, I could have taken that guy out to the woods and shot him, but I didn't. I turned him into the police. So that's a really crucial part about how their experiences were personal. They were not on a revenge mission. They were there to follow the rules of war and to do it properly. And what he said over and over again in all of his interviews was, we are different from them. We Jews are different from the Germans. So that's sort of how he understood what happened to him. Another guy write about is Ron Gilbert, whose sister ends up going into hiding in France. His parents are killed. Almost all of them have lost their parents. Manfred Gans is basically the only one who doesn't lose his parents. His parents are killed. He and his sister escape. He gets put on the Danera, unfortunately. He becomes one of the fiercest warriors in the war. And once he hears that Paris has been liberated, he goes to his commanding officer and he says, I need to go find my sister. And the commanding officer says, okay, I'm going to give you like a week. You can go to Paris to try and look for your sister. And he actually finds his sister who's been hiding. She's just had a kid. It's an incredible story. And I have a photo of the two of them together reunited. It's so beautiful. And then there's the story of Manfred Gans, which is its own story about sort of finding his parents who have been taken to Terezin stock concentration camp. It's what Washington Post wrote about. But those are the unusual stories. The more usual story is that of Colin Anson. And the even more usual story is the majority of them. I'll tell you a story about this guy who's on the cover of the book holding the Tommy gun. This is probably the most typical story. That's Jeff Broadman. So when I was writing the book, Jeff Broadman was like totally physical superhero guy in the book, right? So when I was writing the book, I got in touch with his son to interview him about his dad. And his son, like Jeff, who survives the war and spends his whole life in the British military, his son after the war, his son spends his whole life in the military too. So before lockdown, I was really lucky. I got to go to London to interview all these kids of Commandos, and a lot of them came to the United States. So I was interviewing people all over the world, basically, and the living Commandos. And so I met his son, Ander, at a pub outside of a London train station to interview him for the book. And he brought all these letters his dad had written. He brought a letter from their commanding officer, which he really cherished. And so I'm sitting there at this pub with this like big male military guy, really sweet. And I say to him, So I have to ask you what I have to ask everybody when I write the book, and I'm sorry, but I have to ask this. What happened to Jeff's parents? Because Jeff goes to the UK when he's like 16. And I'm just facing this guy, and he just bursts into tears and he just starts sobbing. It was so terrible. And he just cried and he cried. And I didn't say anything. I just sat with him. And I realized this is actually what the book is about. And so he cried, and then he stopped crying. He kind of pulled himself together. I don't think he'd ever talked about this before. And he said, you know, when I was growing up, I never knew my dad, what his story was with the Holocaust. He wouldn't talk about it. And I never knew what happened to my grandparents. And my wife went to Germany to try and figure out what was going on like 2 years ago. And she called me one day and she said, I found out what happened to your grandparents, Jeff's parents, is they were taken to the Lodge ghetto and they were killed at the Lodge ghetto. And then that's when I realized that's actually what this book is about, Jews having agency and fighting back, but it's also all about the Holocaust. So that's probably the most typical story of what happens to them, is they say goodbye to their parents, they get on trains, and they never see them again.
So you talked about certainly what happened and what they did during the war, but they continued that work after. And could you share a little bit with us about what they did, what these commandos did during denazification?
Yeah, so like Ron Gilbert, the one I was just talking about, who finds his sister, he said, he's actually, like he said, he's so macho. He's given a gun and basically said, go find Nazis, people, hidden Nazis. And I have these scenes I write in the book where he goes to train stations with a gun, and there's like a gun battle, and he captures this Nazi. And he's sent to a psychiatric hospital, and he finds that there are a bunch of Nazis hiding, pretending to be psychiatric patients, and he captures them. So a bunch of them are literally given guns to go capture Nazis. Most of them are given jobs sort of like going through paperwork to find information for the Nuremberg trials. That's what Colin Anson, whose dad's killed in Dachau, did. So they're gathering all the information for the Nuremberg trials. A number of them, though, like Manfred Gans, which I think was actually very brilliant of the British, send them back to their hometown. So Manfred Gans is sent back to his hometown of Borken, Germany, that place where he couldn't play in the soccer field anymore or swim in the pool. And they're told to him, you denazify the town. And it's brilliant because he remembers the teacher who was abusive towards all the Jews. And he gets that guy arrested. But he also remembers that one of the mayors, who ends up having been sent to Dachau, protected Jews. So he makes sure that guy, like he goes through the whole town knowing personally what these guys did. Later on, he's actually sent to interrogate high-ranking Nazis from Auschwitz, and he gets information for the Nuremberg trials as well. But the first step for a number of them, which is so great for them, I mean, talk about getting your agency back, is being sent back to their hometowns to root out the Nazis who started this whole thing going in the first place.
It's really why they all started this in the first place. It's why they took on this role, and probably, you know, bringing it full circle, especially for those who lost family members, which many or most of them did, to be able to then sort of have that sense of I don't know if I call it retribution, but really to feel like they were able to do something, even after feeling so helpless in certain ways.
And they actually all said, like, to a man, they said over and over again, being a commando was sort of like the best thing that ever happened to them, because they literally got to go kill and capture Nazis. I mean, one of them, Ian Harris, said something like, what Jewish kid wouldn't dream of that? And they were so good at it that they made it so the Brits won. Like, it's crazy what they were able to accomplish too. Yep.
So at the end of the war, you have this group of commandos who are dispersed and doing this work. And many of them, well, some of them kept their names, their British names, and some of them did not. So why did many of them keep their new names and identities? And also, I know we touched on this before, what happened when they were buried? I know that there there are a few examples of, in one case, a commando noting where some of his fellow commandos were buried, and wanting to make sure that someone would go back and change the crosses to Magen David's. And I know you talked about it in terms of the monument, but what happened to all of them all over Europe?
Right. Okay. So the majority of them keep their British names. Most of those who stay in the UK don't raise their kids Jewish. They completely assimilate. I talked to with the kids of one of them, and I said, why do you think that was the case? And he said he just wanted his kids to be safe. Like, I think that Germany is really close still to, like, physically close. It felt close to them after the war. And so most of those who stay in the UK assimilate, stay Church of England, don't talk to their kids about it. Their kids all sort of figured it out because I interviewed all their kids. But typical of that generation too, the parents, the dads didn't want to talk about it. Those who come to the United States, most of them raise their kids as Jewish, reclaim their Jewish identity, feel a freedom here that they can do that. Manfred Gans is one of the only ones who switches his name back. And I think that the reason most of them keep their British names is twofold. One is that they become commandos at the point at which they're becoming adults. So they really are that person they became, right? That's their adult identity, these strong guys who fought back and all that. I think the other reason that the majority of them probably didn't switch back their names was the names of their moms and dads who were now gone. The way that Israelis often change their names to sort of take on a different identity. Out of the trauma. I think that's probably the other reason. As for those buried under crosses, Martin Sugarman, that guy I keep mentioning, he has been on a life mission to get them changed to Magen David's. We can only do it, because I'm work with him on this stuff, we can only do it with the permission of the families. So some of the families, it's like, it's still too painful and too traumatic. Not only the kids I interviewed for the book, but other people haven't had the crosses changed to Magen David's, but a majority of them have been, which is awesome. So like the one I talked about just a few months ago, that's because until that woman contacted me, Martin didn't know of any of the relatives to this person. So it's really a great thing about the book, which is that hopefully the majority of the rest of them will be changed to Magen David's. And that's why the ceremony was so incredible. I just have to say, it wasn't just a military ceremony, it was a full Jewish ceremony with a rabbi. I mean, it couldn't have been more beautiful than what it was.
That's amazing. And, it's interesting you mentioned that Manfred Gans changed his name back, and his was a unique story. His parents he went and found them. I mean, it was the dream I think that all of them had, that they would be able to go back to a camp. He went, he found them, and that's just an incredible story. And so that's his way of honoring his parents, was to be able to be part of that family.
Yeah, and I have this beautiful picture of his family in Israel. Like they immigrate to Israel, and he wrote a diary when he went to rescue his parents, and I quote from it in the book. So it's really cool. Like it's so interesting, when he was going on the rescue mission to rescue his parents from Terezin, they'd been in Bergen-Belsen before. That's probably my favorite chapter in the book. It's so incredible when he's on this mission. The war's still going on and he's going through Germany, but he knew as well that this was huge. So he consciously kept a diary of it, because I'm sure he thought to himself, nobody's going to believe this. And the thing about, it's so funny, after his parents were rescued, somebody interviewed his parents, and his mom said, if anyone was going to rescue us, it was going to be Manfred. Like we knew, like, there's no one in the world who could pull this off but Manfred, and Manfred, of course, pulls it off. So Manfred must have knew he was going to somehow magically have the luck that his parents were still alive to pull this off.
It really just incredible. And I know that the ending that so many had hoped for. And it's nice and that was one of my favorite parts of the story too, because we all know the majority of stories which were not as happy, and to have that really just was so uplifting. I have a few questions that came in from some of those who are listening, and one was about something that you mentioned earlier on, which is you mentioned about the American Ritchie group, and there were some similarities in some ways, but the question is, was there any communication And I think the Ritchie group was created, it looks like in 1942. Was there any
Yeah.
communication between the British and the Americans regarding creating these groups?
There wasn't, and I'm also often asked if there was any ties with this in Israel, and there wasn't, because this group was so top secret that the news of them only came out after like 1947, 1948, because publicly they were the British troop. Nobody knew. There was one secretary at MI5 who had the list of their real names. It was top secret through the entire war, for two reasons. One is that the British were trying to protect them because these were all Jews and Germans, and they would have all been killed. But two, as the British military said, they didn't want the Germans to know that these guys existed, that there was this group of these incredible German Jewish warrior commandos who were coming after them. So the news never got out. There was no connection. It didn't hit Israel. It was just this top secret thing, which is why also partially it took the book so long to be written, because I had to declassify a lot of material to tell the story.
And somebody just put in the chat asking if England ever publicly acknowledged the existence of X troop, etc.
So in 1947 or 48, Lord Mountbatten, who helped organize it, did a public dinner in which he talked about them and said that they were the best commanders of the war, and the papers covered it for like 6 months. Then it basically disappeared and nobody knew about it. Martin Sugarman, that guy, wrote a chapter on it. A few military historians wrote a few chapters on it here and there, but no, it's just kind of disappeared. Some of the guys like Manfred Gans wrote it like a self-published autobiography, but there was no bigger sort of story of it. But with the book coming out, it's been crazy how much press it's gotten in the UK. It was serialized, this book about these Jewish, in the Daily Mail, which is like where everyone goes to read about the queen and the princess. So because now it's sort of broadly out, it's coming out in paperback in May, and they're actually selling it all to all the in the UK, they sell paperback books in grocery stores. So it's gonna that's where it's gonna be. But that's all I ever wanted, to be honest. I wanted the Brits to know that these Jewish guys were so central to them winning the war. So now the news is out, which is just awesome.
It is awesome. And I just put for everyone, in case you signed in later than we put the link in, another link to the book to be able to buy it through our WHC Mitzvah Mall. Another question following up on what we talked about earlier. What happened to the Nazis who were rooted out? We hear that so many lower level Nazis got off without punishment. So what happened?
That's what happened. So many lower level Nazis got off without punishment. You know, it's so interesting. This will be very controversial, but you know, we have this sort of mantra that the Germans have reckoned with the past. I don't buy it for a second. It's so interesting. This book's being published in like Romanian and Polish. Germans aren't publishing this book. Manfred Gans, after the war, he would fly back. It's so incredible to Borken on Kristallnacht to do talks with the local high school kids to talk about what happened during the war. But generally in Borken, not much happened to anyone who should have been punished. So, I mean, that's my own sense of it, that yes, whoever wrote that question is correct. They got the high-ranking Nazis, but it takes a village not only to protect children, but to kill children. And that, in my opinion, there's actually been remarkably little reckoning with all this in Germany. I'm sorry, I know that's very controversial, but writing this book and sort of seeing the stories, I also get it why none of them settled back in Germany. They all, stayed in the UK or came to America or went to Canada.
So on the topic of how widely publicized the story is, and again, great write-up in the Washington Post. I'll put that back in the chat again in a moment. But someone asked, do you think this will be on 60 Minutes, or will there be other places that we're going to see the story more, especially as the book is read, which again, encouraging everyone to please buy this book, read it. The story is amazing if you have not already read it.
You know, it's interesting. I get asked a lot about if it's going to be made into a TV or movie. And like I've never had this in my life, but I had to get an agent for this book because of stuff. And, you know, like we've been contacted about stuff, so we'll see. But it's so interesting because, you know, when writing this book, I was thinking about sort of Hollywood and representations of the Holocaust. And I was thinking about Schindler's List and these other representation. It's always about Gentiles saving Jews. I think there's a great deal of discomfort with this idea of Jews having agency and, when possible, saving themselves. I think that, you know, the way that a lot of Americans are uncomfortable with strong Israeli Jews, I think a lot of Americans are uncomfortable with strong sort of World War II Jews who are fighting. So it was covered on CNN, Time Magazine, all this stuff. There's been a great deal of coverage. My hope, though, is that there is a movie about these guys, because I think that it challenges the narrative that it was only Gentiles who saved Jews. Jews were fighting back everywhere they could. We know this. Jews know this. In the Warsaw Ghetto, they were always fighting back. But unfortunately, I think that mainstream America isn't aware enough of this. I think they're more comfortable with the story of Gentiles saving Jews. Does that sound terrible?
No, but honestly, I mean, this has all the makings of a Hollywood masterpiece. I mean, it really would be an engaging, the fact that the story is real is incredible. And everything about it, you can, I'm sure some people could already picture who would play which commando, but it's got all
my daughters say it has to be Timothy Chalamet, so I'm just putting that out there. But I think, Dora Horn wrote that book about People Love Dead Jews. Mm-hmm. I think she's onto something. I mean, I do think that this goes against the narrative quite a bit.
Yeah. Are you working on anything now?
I am. I'm working on a new book because I love my tough Jews. So my new book that I'm working on now, I just started like 3 weeks ago, is I'm writing a book about, if anyone has family members, please email me, about all these prominent Jewish gangsters like Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, and in the UK, who in the 30s and 40s fought fascists. Beat up Germans, fought fascists on the streets of New York, Newark, LA. During World War II, Meyer Lansky worked with the government as part of Operation Underworld. So it's a book about Jewish gangsters who were on the front lines fighting fascism. Same kind of theme. Yeah.
Well, amazing stories that are out there. And we are so incredibly grateful to you, Dr. Garrett, for bringing these stories to light, for telling them in a way that the story itself certainly is captivating, but the way that you write about it puts us right there in the middle of the action, and it really is truly incredible. And so I encourage everyone who's listening and watching to read this book, to learn just another side of the story. The piece that was in the Washington Post, which is in the chat, came out on Holocaust Remembrance Day, and what better way to honor the memories of those who were lost than to tell the stories of Jewish resilience and survival and strength, and that's how we honor all of those memories. And so we're grateful to you for your storytelling, and we're so grateful for your time this morning.
So thank you, Rabbi. And thank you, everyone. And feel free to email me if you have any questions or comments too. I'm at Hunter College. You can Google me.